Back in March, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's ruling Justice and Development Party, or AK Party, suffered surprising losses in local elections across Turkey, including in Istanbul and Ankara for the first time in almost 20 years. But the Turkish president refused to concede, and earlier this month, the country's High Election Council announced a rerun of the Istanbul mayoral election to be held on June 23rd. So, is this just the latest step on the road to Turkish autocracy, or is Erdogan, as his supporters say, just protecting the integrity of the election process? Joining me to debate this from Istanbul, Harun Armagan, a senior member of the AK Party and its former Vice Deputy Chairman for Human Rights, and Mustafa Akyol, senior fellow at the Cato Institute and contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. Harun, your party suffered significant losses in the local elections in March, including in Istanbul, where your president used to be the mayor. In a democracy, many would say you're supposed to respect the election result, not demand multiple recounts, and then have a rerun of the whole election just because your candidate didn't win.
Oh, Mehdi, you're just repeating the opposition accusations, which are not true. The election is going to rerun because there is an independent body, electoral commission, made a decision to go to a rerun for two reasons. Because number one is that there were unauthorized people appointed as ballot box officers. Number two, there were irregularities in vote counting sheets, which in the law clearly says that in these sort of cases, if it's impacting the final result of the election, it goes to a rerun. And it's not the first time. In last municipal elections, there were 14 municipalities that went to rerun for similar reasons.
When you say irregularities, voters in Istanbul didn't just vote for mayor on March 31st. They cast 4 different votes on 4 different pieces of paper that were all put into the same envelope before going into the ballot box. But you're not calling for a rerun of all 4 votes. How come 3 are okay, but one of the votes is irregular? That makes no sense to me.
No, the reason is very simple, Matt, if you know the law. Because the difference between the 2 candidates in Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality is very small. It's 13,000 votes, which are lower than the number of the ballot boxes that are impacted from the irregularities. If you look at the local municipalities, yes, the irregularities are there, valid for them as well, but they are not impacting the final result because the difference is more.
Okay, Mustafa, it's an independent body calling for a rerun, and they were voting irregularity. What's the problem?
Well, Mehdi, I think it's not that simple. And I should first say this. I'm really sad about what Turkey has become. It's my country. We had a great accomplishment in the early 21st century. We were the shining star of the Muslim world. Unfortunately, it devolved into a grim authoritarian scene in the past 6 years. And a lot of things have gone down, right? Freedom of speech, independent press, a lot of things have gone down already. But at least the elections were there. At least elections were trusted. And now, with the cancellation of the Istanbul elections, unfortunately, now there are question marks about even the accuracy of elections and the legitimacy of elections in Turkey. It will be there. Even former president, former Abdullah Gül, former prime minister Ahmet Davutoğlu, who were the people who built this party, said that this is really a bad thing for our democracy. There are independent scholars who don't see any reason, any legitimate reason for the cancellation of the elections. The elections are canceled on a technicality, that there were not there are more than 30,000 ballots in Istanbul. In 200 of them, the people who are the head of the team counting the ballots were not government officials. They didn't used to be government officials for decades. This is a new law the AKP brought. The fact that they were not government officials doesn't prove any misdeed there or a miscount. It's just a technicality. And that technicality is not used to cancel other elections across Turkey in which the opposition lost. The only place where opposition won, which is Istanbul, the most important place, is now being canceled. And the ruling party will have its arguments, but other than themselves, nobody in Turkey believes this is fair.
If I may come in, I think, Mustafa, you're wrong here. Because in Yusufeli, one of the cities in east of Turkey, northeast of Turkey, CHP, the opposition party, appealed to the independent board for a very similar reason. And it was the AK Party won municipality. After their appeal, the election board accepted their appeal, and it went to rerun. And also, it's not only in Turkey. If you remember recently, 2016 Austrian presidential elections, for almost identical reasons, it went to a rerun. when the decision was made from Supreme Court in Austria, no one was talking about going back into democracy. No one was talking about anything else. Why we hear this double standard and hypocritical comments in Turkey?
Let me ask you this question. You said earlier that I was just repeating opposition talking points, but it's not just the opposition who have been criticizing the rerun of this election. As Mustafa pointed out, Abdullah Gül, the former president of Turkey, member of your party, the AK party, has said that it casts a shadow over our democracy. Ahmet Davutoglu, former prime minister, member of your party, has said it's caused our fundamental values to be undermined. Are they also opposition members now?
Look, Mehdi, first of all, these two gentlemen are founders of AK Party and very respected senior politicians of our party, and we always note when they do criticism. And yeah, and of course they are open to give their opinions. We hear their opinions. They are able to make their criticism. Indeed, this is what makes AK Party a very democratic party, because everyone can do their criticism. They may disagree with the decision. Indeed, this was not something we were wishing for as AK Party to go to rerun as well. I agree that they have right to raise their criticism, which makes AK Party a democratic party, which makes actually AK Party always improving itself and winning elections. But at the same time, there is a law. There is a law that doesn't have to follow people's opinions, or doesn't have to. Law, just these are the judges, senior judges, that makes this decision, and they are making this decision based on law, not someone else's comments. I mean, maybe they made an unpopular choice to go to repeat these elections, but at the same time, this was the right decision according to the law.
Mustafa, to be fair to the AKP, doesn't the fact that they're not demanding reruns in places like Adana or Mesrine, where they also lost to the opposition, doesn't that maybe suggest that there is a genuine objection they have in Istanbul? Because they're not asking for reruns across the board, across the whole country, are they?
No, they're not asking for a rerun in Ankara as well, which they lost.
So
and I think the reason is Istanbul is the most important thing in the scene. Secondly, there's a really close call. I mean, they lost with a very small margin. But the mere fact that elections are rerun in Turkey when the ruling party thinks that they're not helpful, that's a stain on our democracy.
Harun, the fact remains that the AK party did lose to the opposition in other cities throughout Turkey. How do you interpret those losses? Aren't they a referendum on President Erdogan's rule? Aren't they evidence of dissatisfaction from the Turkish public with Erdogan's rule?
No, Mehdi, no, nothing related to those. But if you look at the elections, the municipal elections, the nature of municipal elections are very different than general elections. People vote as much as people vote for the candidates, as much as they vote for the services offered and the party. So people have made their decision for the general election last year for President Erdogan with a significant landslide win. So interpreting this municipal election results as a general election would mislead us. It's wrong. That's not correct. And even if you do that, Mehdi, if you look at the general popular vote, AK Party still won 53% general vote in this election.
Can I say something on that, mate?
Briefly, yeah.
There's no doubt that President Erdogan and AKP is still popular in Turkey. There's no doubt about that. The problem is the rest of the country is being demonized by the propaganda machine of the government. In Turkey, the problem we have is a very divisive rhetoric which considers one political line legitimate and the other one is illegal. So, I'm not saying that the President Erdogan is the only person doing this.
Mustafa, to be fair, you're Turkish, I'm not, but to be fair, you're now based in the US, where you're working at a US think tank, you write for the New York Times. Many would say the US is a country where the president delegitimizes the opposition, doesn't treat all sections of society equally. And so many in Turkey, and you've heard this, many in Turkey would say we're being demonized by the West. There's always a reference to a sultan or to an Ottoman Empire. There's a Western media bias against Turkey, against Erdogan.
Yes, I agree
what do you
with
say to that?
There is polarization in the US too, very venomous polarization. And I actually see some of the populist narrative I know from Turkey in the US politics as well.
Yeah.
Today in the hands of, for example, President Trump and some of his supporters. But in the US, there are institutions, there are certain checks and balances. When President Trump passes a Muslim ban, a judge can stop that. In Turkey, that judge would be in trouble himself. In the US, there is independent media. President Trump calls it the enemy of the people. But that term doesn't become an indictment to put a newspaper journalist in jail. In Turkey, the problem is that populist wave, which is now all across the world is so strong, and it crushed institutions.
Okay, so let's
and
ask.
it left very little
So
independent
let's ask
media.
Harun about that.
So we have a very
Come on,
advanced
Mustafa.
version of populism in
that's
Turkey.
not true.
In the US, I see other problems as well. In the Western democracies, I see other problems as well.
Harun.
I mean, I think it is not unfair to
I
say
don't- I
the
don't
majority of
accept those
Turkish media
accusations.
has become nothing but a propaganda machine for the government. The 90% of the Turkish media has become like that. I mean, we are all in
Okay,
it.
let Harun respond.
Absolutely, I disagree with this point, and it makes no sense. Mustafa, where did you get this 90% number? It doesn't reflect the reality, and you very well know that. If you talk about the media ownership by private businessmen, that's a global problem. That's a global problem for that's a global problem for many countries. If you allow me to make my points, Mustafa. There is a reason.
Okay, please say your point and I'll say it.
If you're complaining about the media ownership by few businessmen, this is a common problem for many countries. For example, Rupert Murdoch in the UK has more than 50% of British media, but you never claim that that becomes a problem for British democracy, and you're just making these numbers are made up. I don't think that there is 90% control of media in Turkey by government. They are individual businessmen, and if I have to add one, Mehdi, let me add this point. Mehdi. And Mustafa's father himself is an opposition journalist in Turkey. He criticized the government several times, and I read him. He's a very respected senior journalist. Are you telling me that Mustafa, your father, is just keeping his position because he never criticized the government?
I
That's
didn't
nonsense.
say
You all know that.
100%
Let's
of
be
the
really
Turkish
serious here.
media is controlled by the government. I said almost 90% of the media is controlled by the government, and my father is in that 10% right now.
That is
and
wrong.
There are other people, respected people, journalists, yes, who say
That is
respected
wrong.
things.
You very well
If there
know
are
that.
people ever criticizing the government,
Okay.
in that 90%, they lose their job. One of them is Kemal Öztürk, who just was fired from Yeni Şafak. We all know this, let's be honest. In Turkey, media owners, several media
individual
owners
cases, you very well
had
know
to
that.
sell their
But Mustafa,
newspapers.
every journal.
Let me finish. In Turkey, people like Murdoch you refer to, they had to sell their newspapers, which were bought by people who were friends with the government, and they transformed those newspapers. They fired the editors, reporters, and columnists who are critical of the government. Let's be honest about this.
We have nothing
Let's
to
be
do with
honest.
that.
You
It
can
has
think
nothing
this
to
is the
do with our
people's will.
government.
You can say the nation
Harun,
is
let me-
winning. But
let's
let's be
be
honest. Let's be honest that Hürriyet, Milliyet,
Okay, you made
all
your
the
point. Let
newspapers
Harun
in
respond.
Turkey have
Mustafa.
been transformed.
Harun, will you concede any of that, or are you saying there's been no change in
are-
all of the
these are-
world's human rights groups who have pointed out the lack of media freedoms, the media consolidation, the record number of arrests of journalists in Turkey? Turkey now jails more journalists than any other country in the world. Are you denying all of that? We're just imagining all of that?
Mehdi, these accusations have no basis. First of all, changing ownership in the media is a decision that those businessmen can make. We have nothing to do with those decisions. And also, if I have to be more specific, David Aronovich, for example, he left The Guardian and he went to the Times because his line wasn't really matching with The Guardian's line.
But David Aronovich hasn't been
these things
arrested
can
or
happen.
detained
People,
in the UK.
journalists
You
can
know
leave-
that
can
many,
leave.
many journalists have been arrested and detained in Turkey, so it's not a very good analogy. You know that tens of thousands of people, academics, judges,
I'm very
prosecutors,
glad you
in
brought
the
it
wake
up.
of the coup,
I'm
have all
very-
been detained. You know that. Come on. You know that tens of thousands of people have been detained in Turkey. You're not denying that.
I'm very glad you brought it up, Mehdi. I'm very glad you brought it up because I now have chance to clear that up. First of all, in Mustafa's own words, I think in 2018, when he was speaking in Brussels, he said, from his own words, he clearly said that the Gülenist cult, the religious cult, they had a big power on bureaucracy, the military, the police, the judiciary, and media and education. And those guys later on tried to overthrow an elected government. And obviously those people who are involved in this criminal activity will will later on have the consequences in terms of law. And you very well know that. these number of journalists that you give are nonsense. One of them are in jail because he actually published a sex tape of opposition leader. One of them is in jail because he murdered a person.
Whataboutism
Not all of
doesn't
them are.
solve
Not
Turkey's
all,
problems.
not all
Western
of them
democracy has a lot of problems as well. Turkey has 10 times more of that. And unless we don't even acknowledge that those problems exist, Turkey will not go anywhere better.
Guys, we've run out of time. Harun, Mustafa, we'll have to leave it there. We're out of time. Apologies. That was very lively. And that's our show. Upfront will be back later this year.